make something actually a GitOps solution or part of a GitOps solution. And so those principles are outlined here on the GitOps working group, but the definition is going to lay it out in a bit more detail. So this is something that we're working on now. This will be this is a document that Alexis Richardson at Weaveworks put together. He was the person who actually coined the term GitOps back in 2017. And so we'll use this as a root, but this is not the first draft. So if you have comments or questions or concerns, this is a place to certainly add your comments. It looks like Mia added in some good notes here already. So we invite people to put in your questions. What we will be doing is ideally presenting an initial draft at next month's meeting and then opening it up for discussions in GitHub. So that'll be in GitHub. We'll open up GitHub discussions around that specifically so that the community can contribute. But before that, if you do have specific questions or comments, this document is a great place to add them. And please do put attribution. We don't have contact information for everybody. And if you, I think everybody knows, if you contribute to a Google document anonymously, we have no idea how to respond to that. So if you do want to track, please make sure to check back on the document or add in your contact information. Other folks on the maintainer team, anyone want to flesh out anything that I just said around the definition for the manifesto before we open it up to the floor? Going once, waiting for everybody to find the unmute button. All right. So any folks not on the maintainer team have questions, have suggestions, anything to add here?
So I put in an issue. I think I opened it back in December. We were looking for a work product name, and I don't know what people think about GitOps commitments. It was just, I felt like a kind of a fun, kind of a 12-factor app kind of style name rather than manifesto.
I think I remember seeing that comment. So commitments. All right, that is, and there was some discussion around the term manifesto at the last at the last working group session as well. So that's something, and I think we don't need to lock down the name until I think, at least from my perspective, the definition is more important than the name, but that is a that is a fun way to do it and say commitments, because it does assume that every solution that says it's going to be GitOps conformant or follow the principles is making a commitment. So that might be one option, certainly. All right. Other topics from the floor, questions?
So regarding the GitOps commitment or manifesto, I think it's probably easiest to start with something concrete as a PR on the GitOps working group repository. So I'm very happy to try and put a PR together based on this document, and then we can work collaboratively in GitHub. I think that might be a good way of people proposing changes, voting up changes, voting down changes on a GitHub PR, and then at the we can present this at the next working group meeting, and then if we have a consensus at the next working group meeting around what we have, then we can merge that PR and say we've kind of done the first work stream around the manifesto or the commitments.
Yep, I think that's a good way to do it, so it's done out in the open. All right. Well, we don't have as much discussion as we had in the last meeting, so wonderful. So any other points on the GitOps definition or manifesto discussion before we move on to talking about the website?
I'm guessing this call's purpose is not to kind of go in depth into the various questions and comments and whatnot that are in that document, right? Like the idea is to leave that offline, or do we want to go into more in-depth conversation within this group as to some of the concerns or questions raised in the current version of this document?
We have about 10. So I had allocated a little more time, like up to 12 to 35 after, to talk about this. So if there are a few constructive comments and suggestions, I think we can certainly discuss it as a group. We do definitely want to take notes and make sure to do it out in the open. But since the folks here took the time to come, I think, you know, discussion can be warranted, at least from my perspective.
It's probably worth going over any high-level comments now, but keep the detailed feedback, like individual wording, etc., for an offline discussion, so we don't take up too much time during this meeting. But I think, I don't know whether I speak for everybody on the call, but I think I'd love to hear what high-level comments people have about this. But probably, as I said, we don't want to get into the weeds of the details.
Okay. Well, in that case, there's a couple of things that I commented on the definition document that I think are food for thought. There's kind of like I think the concept of closed loop is one of the principles that require further thinking, right? When we think about it in terms of closed loop, and Cornelia had spoken at some point of kind of like the idea is that the code in the repository is reflected in the runtime environment, right? The runtime is always a reflection of the desired state. But what happens if the desired state cannot be met, right? If it cannot be reached. So how is that loop going to close back? How is it going to reflect that back into the repository? And whenever I think about that, I keep struggling with the idea that, for instance, you may have one single source of truth, one single repository, one single manifest that is being synced up against numerous target clusters, right? So how would it work if just one of those clusters failed, right? How does the closed loop behave in that scenario? So that's kind of like one of the couple of things that I think are rich for discussion. I'm curious to hear what people think.
Kind of agree.
Yes.
Yeah. There's somebody gonna go?
Yeah, let's go with either Brees. Let's go with Brees first, or Dan or Brees. It looked like you were both going to say something. Brees, you go.
Okay. Yeah. So we've actually I've talked about this in the past, actually, about kind of what ought to happen if the software can't close the loop, basically. And I think that's really a failure condition that should be treated as such. And we can certainly try to converge towards desired state. And that's what, you know, the ideal case is it's a transient failure and you eventually converge to desired state, which we know is going to happen pretty often. But the case where you really can't, and after retrying multiple times, you still can't converge, feels like that would be an error. And it's essentially where the software involvement in resolution stops and where the human involvement begins. Because if a failure to resolve and to converge state keeps occurring, essentially there's an error in your system and the software isn't smart enough to solve the error. For example, you've run out of compute node in EC2 that requires a manual request to increase your usage limit, right? So that's requiring a human in the loop. So I think, and this is just me talking about how I've been discussing GitOps in the past, but a failure to converge to the desired state is an error and should be treated as such. And that's when humans need to start getting involved. Because for transient failure, like a node going down, like a node no longer being available, the software agent should be able to reconcile and bring another node back up to reconcile the required state. But if it can't do that, then it's usually a sign of a failure that requires a human intervention.
Which to me sounds like there might be a gap in our definition currently in how we specify how GitOps should handle that type of failure, right? Like we're talking about everything should be automated and everything should reconcile, but there is little coverage as to what is the GitOps way of doing things when things go wrong, right? Like how does GitOps handle failure?
Yeah, the definitions and talking points we've had have mostly been around the happy path or the success path. I think you're quite right that talking more about the failure case and what that requires of kind of a well-behaved GitOps system is probably quite useful to have in our definition.
Yeah, Engine has a note in chat is, would this not be part of Kubernetes, right? As opposed to GitOps.
I want to add on that the feedback is part that is not talked about in GitOps, and we're talking about the Git as the interface. And if that's the interface, we must have some way to get feedback back to it. So it's right that you can check the logs, you can view Kubernetes, you can understand what happens, but that's making the feedback loop bigger. And we want to keep it small.
Yep. Yep. Very good point.
I think you've talked about this in the past, O'Neill, haven't you? About the way GitOps is fundamentally tied to observability, and how observability, the way of observing your system state is required. And it's not just required for humans, but it's required programmatically so that a system we can actually verify that the system meets its definition. So there's an observability aspect to GitOps that I think you're quite right, Engine. It's not, I think it was Engine. It's not really fleshed out in this document yet.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that bingo. I mean, I think the observability is a big part of it, and observability comes through a number of different means. It might be notifications, it might be having the right, the right metrics available, et cetera, et cetera. But in my mind, actually, that closed loop category is exactly where some of that stuff belongs. Now, we haven't fully defined what closed loop means, but in my mind, that's exactly what we're getting at with closed loop, is to say, okay, when we think about OODA loops, we think about these, circular things all the time. There's always the, act, what is it? OODA is, observe, orient, act. And so it's that observe part. And so I feel like closed loop, maybe it shouldn't be closed loop, maybe it should be observability or something like that. But there's a whole host of things that are needed to take what's a partial loop right now and to close it all the way. And this dialogue has really crystallized that in my mind. And so I would assert that actually the closed loop is, if you will, a placeholder for some of the concerns, Leonardo, that exactly the ones that you teed us up with and that others have chimed in with. And that's maybe the abstraction that we need to do further fleshing out on as we build the manifesto or I'm scrolling back, the commitment that as we build out that definition. Really good call out.
Great. That's
I
one.
believe Jesse was, yes, Jesse.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. So to Leonardo's point, the first thing that popped into my head, this doc is new to me. So I work at AWS. I'm a DA. Hi, everybody. So I think there's a scoping call out here too, right? And I've thought this for a while. It may be addressed in the doc, but basically when we're talking about GitOps, we're talking about automation. We're talking about a system that implements the methodology. And when you move to multiple clusters, when you move to multiple repos, and I see there are some notes here that there's no automation glue above Kubernetes. And of course, Kubernetes is a cluster. So, and obviously there's really weird backbending that can happen in cluster API land, and we can do lots of things with controllers, but I think it needs to be called out at a high level here, sort of what the methodology proposes around sort of the point between a failure to resolve, as Leonardo pointed out, and where humans get involved, as Bryce called out, right? There is a gap there, and I think a lot of it has to do with scoping. And like I said, I'll look at the doc and I'll make some notes too, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that I think that's an important aspect of this.
Comment.
Yeah, and whether that might belong in a solution, right? Or if it's part of the GitOps definition. I think that's that's where we're
Right.
drilling down to. Right?
Yeah, I think the methodology at least has to advise, right? The manifesto commitments, whatever it's called. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Any other? So that's a good one. I mean, we're up at 35 past, but any other questions, comments before we move on to a more tactical discussion around a website and the things that should be components within it? That's a cute little baby you got there, Leonardo.
He's getting trained already.
Be careful.
Yeah. There you go.
All right. So moving on to the website. So the idea is, and where the discussions have come is that it's great to have a GitHub repository. And it's certainly tremendous for the technical amongst us that understands how it works. But really, we also need to have a website that's more publicly digestible. So we were thinking that something lightweight, like the 12-factor app website, is probably, the appropriate difference between something lightweight and something with a little more content than a GitHub repo. I think already today we have heard that, that maybe it's good to have a press mention section, and certainly for those of us that need to make a living selling solutions, it's very helpful to have a section that's going to help customers understand, end users understand that this is a valid way to operate infrastructure and deploy software. And so that could certainly be one component of a website, in addition to what we see on like the 12-factor app. I saw in the comments from Mia that it'd be good to have a terminology or nomenclature section. Another thing that I think is super important, just because when we get seeped into an area, we toss around acronyms like it's nobody's business, and frequently those acronyms are not understandable to people outside a community. So another good section would be, just a terminology or nomenclature section. Other things that may be worth having on a website that are a little more robust than 12-factor. Thoughts from Dan? Go ahead.
Ideas that we were kind of throwing around was if we had something, and I'm calling it patterns for now, and patterns would be reference architectures like the one that Engine is mentioning, and it would be like, oh, if you're doing, if you want to do a pattern, maybe it's with AWS CloudFormation templates, maybe it's not a Kubernetes thing, then you could have this directory of patterns where you could look up like, oh, these are the AWS patterns, these are the GCP patterns. And I think this could, while we want to have some kind of high level, very generic patterns, right, that are like, this is the very basic high level one, I think it would be interesting to show reference architectures using lots of different tools, using lots of different, flavors and combinations, and people could essentially, submit those. That would invite a lot of community participation, where people would be like, oh yeah, I want to show the pattern that uses our thing that our customers are having success with. Great, let's submit that pattern, and we can tag it with the different technologies, and people can kind of look through these patterns and have discussions on them. They can do pull requests on them. I think that would be really neat.
Yeah, I would add that I think that that's like super useful, especially if it links back to a repo where you can fork it and actually create your own reference implementation, because I think that that's something that is definitely missing, and helps with ease of use, right? It's kind of like a recipe for putting together the particular stack that works in a GitOps fashion. So that's a great one. Other suggestions?
A quick comment. There was a conversation from the CD Foundation. Somebody asked in the GitOps channel, there is a SIG interoperability special intergroups in the CD Foundation, and they were compiling kind of like a common, what's the word? Just this document where they record the different terminology that CD tools use. So they have kind of like Jenkins and all these things, to basically get aligned as to what the common terminologies are around continuous delivery, right? I actually contributed with the Argo CD terminology, because there's the concepts of pipelines and jobs and whatnot do no longer really apply necessarily in the GitOps world, right? So that type of translation, I think it's also relevant as we have people that are doing already some sort of continuous delivery, but they want to start thinking GitOps, and they have a hard time understanding where the pipeline fits. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of a translation between, it's kind of like everybody says CI/CD, as in it's one term when it's certainly not one thing.
Yeah, like
right?
how do you do a pipeline on GitOps? You know, where do you define the pipeline in Flux, right? That doesn't apply anymore. There is, a matter of fact, is that link that Kara shared is precisely the one I'm talking about. The Argo CD section is the one that I added. And you can see right there, like if you go all the way down, where there's kind of like a table of so keep going, like scroll all the way down. You can already see that, for example, for Jenkins and the Spinnaker and all these things, you got the pipeline, the task, and the stage. But with Argo, it's really different, right? You have you're syncing stuff, so it doesn't really work in the same way. And I think this helps people understand the mindset change that also is implied by doing GitOps.
Yeah, that is a very good point. If you're used to thinking about something like this is how you would say it with GitOps, right?
And I think that really can be part of a broader FAQ. I think there are lots of additional things that don't necessarily belong in a definition or a set of commitments, but that are, what does that mean within the frame, within GitOps? And so having that laid out clearly in some sort of frequently asked question, I think is probably a good shout. It's probably a good idea, rather than have it necessarily be in the core document. And I think the website probably deserves a frequently asked question page to cover topics like this.
Mia, you've got your hand up. I think you have something to add to this.
Yeah, big benefit to having like the terminology section too can also be to help create kind of like logical definitions for classes of projects. So like people are talking about Kubernetes a lot, and there's obviously a lot of people that are not using Kubernetes as well. And, working against Nomad or even AWS just directly, having that kind of common terminology can help frame newcomers' mentalities if they're bringing new platforms.
Yeah, and we discussed this a little bit on the initial meeting, that GitOps, and this applies to, we should say, GitOps is the terminology that's been adopted, but you could certainly implement a GitOps fashion workflow using not Git, right? Using SVN, using, older types of source code repositories. Engine, you have your hand up as well?
I just wanted to add also to Leonardo's comments, because it's really pointing to the pain we have also in our company. That's the reason I joined the group, to give a little bit also our side from a traditional company. And the first thing the people ask is like, where do I need to click? Where our business consultants, for example, has to click. And I felt when I first created the 1 or 2 installations of GitOps, I just recreated pipelines for them. So it felt like this for them. And that's what I want to contribute also in this group, to say, okay, we have a strong traditional background where people are used to have, where people also see pipelines as something new. And I'm completely agree. If the people start to copying it bad, it becomes just a different type of pipeline. So I hope it makes sense for you. And if it's too high level, we're going to lose the people, because they think like, oh, it's something for the elite, or it's something for not for me, because that's what I hear all the time when I talk with our projects. They are like, yeah, maybe for other projects, but not for me, because either insert now special snowflake, or we are different. And no, our customer, so in our case, inside the company, they are not like this. They need to click on a button. So we cannot do this automatic stuff. And then we need to talk about and say, okay, where the button moves, maybe to the pull request to trigger the story. So for me, I just want to emphasize this.
Yeah, so something we actually talked about was how this implementation shouldn't be a hindrance. Like, oh, well, we can't benefit from GitOps because we need to have a button. And it's like, well, you can do everything else and have a button, and you will still be way better off than you probably were before. And so I think like what we talked about is that conformance and that kind of stuff, it's really about, it's almost like a spectrum of stuff that you grab and use. And it's like, well, yeah, this is the ideal, work towards the ideal. And, you know, maybe you'll never get there. Maybe you'll always need this, that, or the other thing. But like, there should be enough in the standard that you can get benefit from. And if you decide to modify it, okay, you know, we're not going to, no GitOps police are going to show up and tell you that you can't do that. So we should discuss maybe creating some sort of law enforcement division.
The fun thing is people understood with Argos, for example, they understood the thing better because it was visual. When I tried the GitOps toolkit, for example, I completely lost the guys. They didn't know at all. Maybe you can blame this partly on they have to adapt a little bit more for the Kubernetes way, but with the GitOps toolkit, they were like, what's going on? But when we installed Argo, for example, they had this, we call this like a button you can walk for old people. They're like, yeah, okay, now I understand it because I see visually things. And the sync button, they really loved it because they have the button back again. And I was like, oh no, that's not that's not the intention, honestly. It's just yeah, but
yeah, you know, people like buttons. It's the old familiar way of deploying software. Kevin, do you have something to add? You've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I mean, I spent 4.5 years at Heroku building out a lot of the developer experience and operational experience there. And one of our tricks to get around the button things, we went to HIPAA compliant, and we had a commit status service that once someone had approved it, basically that's how the commit status ended up going to green for that particular requirement, which meant that for the things that needed to be under stronger compliance requirements, it didn't really break our flow because the button to push was the authorization, which then just triggered all of the automation around those things.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, and I think a best practice, especially with more traditional organizations for production deployments, right, where everything works with a GitOps fashion. What needs to be merged to trigger the production deployment is a merge of the pull request that happens in Git, right, and then you continue to meet some of these GitOps principles, and at the and everything's automated, but you also keep your compliance and your accountability. So great point, Cornelia.
Yep, I just wanted to interject that this discussion that we were having, I loved Engine, the anecdote that you had between Argo CD and the GitOps toolkit is, in fact, I was going to say, well, what we're getting at here is observability, and that's absolutely, the button is also an element of control. So there's that nuance that we were talking about, but then there's this observability. People could see what was going on. Now the data is there through the GitOps toolkit and Flux, but it just, when we talk about observability, it's making observability consumable by folks as well. So I just wanted to call out the fact that we were linking back to the earlier discussion around closed loop and observability and how it was showing up in this very concrete case that you were talking about.
All right. Excellent. Nice active discussion. We've got about 2 minutes left for this portion on the website, but what I've made an internal note about is not only do we need, you know, a terminology nomenclature section, but we also need to map that to some commonly understood principles in the previous kind of implementation of CI/CD that was handling the first generation kind of DevOps and IaaS type workloads. In addition, and this is where we'd like to spend the rest of this conversation, is around use cases, because I think that this is probably, and for anyone here who is selling a solution that enables GitOps to end users, you know, the use cases are critical, right? And so I think that this is another portion of the, or not, I don't think, we think that this is another portion of the website that can be tremendously useful to the community at large and really help the end users that become the advocates for GitOps within their organizations drive home how it can be used in their specific organizations. So if we want to talk about a couple specific use cases that folks have seen or implemented, that'll give a route to a section that we can certainly flesh out. Mia, you unmuted. Do you want to go back to the website for a second?
No, I don't know. So it's kind of interesting. We sit a little on the edge of GitOps where at least like my company's product does. So a lot of what we use GitOps today for, kind of more on the consumer end of things, is kind of deploying and managing our infrastructure, kind of like our infrastructure tooling. So if we use like Redash or like any of these third parties like projects, like we'll use GitOps to do a lot of those deployments. Our dev team just switched over to Scaffold for app deployments. They had, they were coming from more of a different workflow. So I don't want to get too much into that, but we pull service metadata from files and repositories. So we actually have kind of a similar kind of GitOps approach where like when people want to kind of track services within their ecosystem, they write metadata files to the repo, and then we crawl repos and pull them all up into our ecosystem so they can like grab metadata about like where their runbooks are located, their product dashboards, so on and so forth. We have looked at like GitOps toolkit as like potentially something we could like extend from for that, but we're still kind of early on that side of the product. We've just largely like hand rolled our own like repo crawling kind of toolkits for now.
Interesting. Cool. Thank you for sharing. So that's definitely one use case on the GitOps side of things is the repo reconciliation, right? And that's the most common use cases for operating Kubernetes clusters, and especially at scale. Other interesting use cases that anyone would like to share today?
I'd like to share kind of like our most complex use case. So we're building a multi-tenant, multi-cluster GitOps CI/CD platform that handles the CD component with GitOps for a network function provider for 5G telcos. So we've run into quite interesting challenges there. Well, some of the challenges are around very much air-gapped environments, right? Where basically you need to deliver your full GitOps platform, repo inclusive, into a cluster that has no outside connectivity whatsoever. So that has been really interesting, where the source of truth lives within the cluster itself, right? You basically running your Git or your Git repo within the cluster, and you have your whichever tool you're using. We're using Argo, syncing against that one repo, and you have to push changes in a very controlled fashion into that in-cluster repo. So there's a lot of challenges there as to how to even bootstrap that cluster when there's nothing available. The other interesting challenge has been around progressive delivery of very much mission critical network functions, right? They have all these different patterns where you might have some container running that you just can't kill because it might be handling some call right now, you know? So it's been a really interesting set of problems to solve. The multi-tenancy of it as well. So there's a lot of meat in that conversation. Matter of fact, there's in the Argo CD community meeting next for February, I'm going to be talking, presenting kind of like how we did the whole Argo CD within air-gap environments. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to document. That's how to
Yeah,
solve
and
those
it's surprisingly common from that use case, or delivery to air-gapped environments via USB stick, right, where you gotta bring everything in one. And there are very, very interesting use cases around that, and multi-tenancy is something that I think is a hot topic across GitOps that we've seen. All right, so that's air-gapped is fun with infrastructure all the time, right? Whether it's for a cruise ship or for a 5G deployment. Other interesting use cases before we wrap it up for the day. Tim, you just unmuted?
Yeah, so I'm thinking DR, right? So this is something we're looking at for our product. Our product does a lot of GitOps-y type stuff, not full blown yet, obviously, but some stuff. But what I'm thinking of, and our OMs have called this business continuity. So not talking about the data, but if something should go wrong, let's say I'm hosting this in a region and the region becomes unconnected or disconnected, how quickly can I stand up everything I need in another region, right? Assuming I have some sort of external process for re-importing my data, a backup of my data. But just the infrastructure, nuts and bolts, right? So everything from the network layer to the infrastructure layer to the Kubernetes layer to the application layer to the user integration, LDAP integration, whatever, all the configuration, all the bits that I need, right? So to me, that there's a pretty exciting opportunity there for GitOps that removes the need for traditional snapshot type backup and restore for your infrastructure bits.
Just pointed out a repo, and depending on what you're using, wait a little bit. Excellent. Yeah. So HA and DR is always a good one, and something, you know, that when you combine it with fleet management, that GitOps certainly starts to simplify. Constantine, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, so I would like to add about our use case. So what was unique about our GitOps use? We've been trying to adjust how GitOps works in context of monorepository and deploying to multiple cluster from one monorepository, and using single build for entire monorepository again, and being able to untangle different deployment streams from GitOps perspective. So I know it's like a lot of people do single repository or single directory in repository, which changes in the triggers pipeline, if we call it this way, but a sequence of changes, GitOps get created, GitOps get merged. For us, we actually, our finding was if we preserve a dependency in our GitOps output target, we could actually run all GitOps targets from a branch in parallel and no pull request in parallel into every environment. And when sequence of merging with pull request is going to be actual sequence of deployment to the different environments. And that was unique. Not a lot of people actually understood how this problem could be solved.
Very interesting. All right. Some great use cases there, and some that come up all the time, right? Especially when you start to scale lots and lots and lots of clusters pointing at a single repo. So all things I think that should be highlighted on the website, and then maybe when we go back to demonstrating solutions, the solutions can be linked back, or the reference implementations can be linked back to the actual use cases for which ones are solved by which solutions or solution stacks. All right, this is terrific. We will be posting the meeting minutes and the recordings, if you have any associates that are interested in the discussion today, up on the GitHub repo. One thing that we will be doing is putting also a notice for creation of the website up there in the repo. So do sign up and submit issues against that, and we'll have instructions there if you'd like to take part in helping set up the GitOps working group website. And we will post the next meeting there as well as the link for it. Anything from any of the other maintainers here on a closing note?
So I saved the chat, and Daniel, I don't know if we have a folder that is owned where like the GitOps working group meeting notes is at or something, but maybe if you want to.
I think what we'll do
is the repo. There's an issue on the repo, and Daniel, actually, I just dropped you a note. We can talk about that. I'd be willing to set that up and organize it a little bit, but you can maybe include that there.
Yeah, and we can just dump the notes out into like some sort of RTF or something, and just add them to the repo too, as a simple way to do it.
All right. Sweet. Thanks everybody. That was awesome. I really enjoyed hearing the use cases, and this is like a real powerhouse group of people. So the big challenge is now that we are starting to put together some of these kind of work streams, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity for people to come in and really make a big impact, which is great.
Yep, +1.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. Look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks a lot, everybody. Great discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.